Hello, everyone. Welcome to Arash's World. Today we have a very special guest. We have Molly Peacock. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Great to be here.
Wonderful for you to come here. Such an honor. So, how would you? This is the toughest question, and we want to get it over with first. How would you briefly
Okay.
describe yourself? And the word is here briefly as well, but what would you say?
Okay. Well, I would say I'm two things. I'm a poet and I'm a biographer. I'm interested in people's lives, and that comes from an interest, a very young interest in my own life and how it was unfolding. I'm 77 years old now, so I've seen a lot of unfolding, and that's what I would say. I'm a poet and a biographer.
Love it. Yeah, awesome. So I saw you on Global TV. Jennifer Palma had her program on Palma Reads, and I was
Yeah.
immediately impressed. And you were talking about your poetry collection, the Widow's Crayon box, and I was fascinated by it by kind of juxtaposing here the widow and here the sense of loss and so on, loneliness with crayon box, which is colorful. So I was intrigued and I said, I need to have Molly on Arash's World, and here you are.
Well, it's great to be here. I know it feels like a contradiction, because a crayon box implies playing, and I do play a lot in the book. I play with language, um, and there's a really wide range of emotions at play too. I I had this idea of grief. I lost my husband 3.5 years ago, and I started writing the poems in the book. Uh, oh, gee, probably 4 or 5 months after he died. And um, I hit on this metaphor that I was feeling so many different kinds of feelings. It wasn't just the simple basic 8 color crayon box. I was feeling the entire 152 huge box of crayons, and that seemed like a metaphor for uh, my experience of widowhood, which at first I thought was a state, like the state of widowhood. But now, almost 4 years later, I realize it's a process.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, that's wonderful. And that's like talking about thinking outside of the box. You're thinking outside of the crayon box as well,
Yes,
and
I
adding
am.
colors
I
to it.
am.
And I just love that. But it's also like the human experience is much more complicated. They're more like it's more colorful. And so the
Yeah.
impression we get about like the grieving process too, and especially here in our world and society, it's there seems to be like really one thing or the other. And it's either like when people say about just grieving and sadness and so on, which is again a huge part of it, of course, the sense of loss. But then there's also others who have the celebration of life, where they celebrate it, and I think
Oh,
it's both,
yes.
right? And
Yes.
it's kind of both. And it's, when you're missing out on one side, then you are not complete, or you're not completely grieving. And I think
Yes.
that's an important aspect of it too.
I didn't understand, because I just sort of bought into traditional ideas of grieving. I didn't understand that you could hold two opposite emotions in your hands at the same time. For instance, you can be happy and grieving at the same time. And that sort of single color of grief, which in my case I thought of as mauve, and I thought, gee, I'm supposed to be a woman in a mauve bathrobe crying at the end of her couch. And I was so busy and so many things were happening. There were so many people, so many things to respond to, people to respond to. I was in motion, and I was in experiencing many colors of emotion, being in motion as well. And all of that um, upended my idea of what was supposed to be happening to me. I mean, I adored my husband. We met when we were teenagers, we didn't get married until we were 45. So we got to have a lot of practice on other people. So when we finally got married, we were very, very sure. And so I felt the drama of his absence, but at the same time, I experienced a lot of relief. I had a lot of caregiving responsibility. As his illness went on, he had melanoma cancer, but he was a cancer survivor for 40 years. So I actually knew that he had cancer when I married him, but he was such a survivor and thrived. He was a marathon runner. He had an international reputation as a scholar. Just for anyone who's listening, my late husband's name is Michael Groden, and he was a James Joyce scholar.
Goodness.
Uh,
I love
yes,
James
I
Joyce.
know, very heady stuff, very, very rarefied stuff, but he was quite a down-to-earth person. So I adored him, but I did feel that I felt a lightness of relief that, finally he was able to have some control over his life because he made medical assistance in dying, which was actually a beautiful process, a beautiful thing for him. The last doctor who interviewed him said, well, what day do you want the procedure? And he said, tomorrow, Thursday. And he was a specialist in James Joyce's Ulysses, and Ulysses takes
Right.
place on a Thursday. And I
Hunter.
thought, oh, how wonderful, how beautiful. He got to choose that because so much is out of your control uh, when you're, oh, you know, um, lurching from illness to one aspect of an illness to the next aspect of an illness. Plus, it was during COVID. Uh,
Mm.
so that's that weird sense of emptiness after he died was also a whole landscape of relief for me. That I just, there are people who I think might have found themselves to be lonely then, but I have quite a capacity for solitude, and I was grateful for my solitude after he passed away. So that's another contradiction, and it's all in the widow's crayon box.
It is. That's what I wanted to say. It takes such a courage to also talk about these things, but you do touch on all these themes as I was going through your poems, and it's like, yes, it is the disease, it is the suffering that you talk about. It is again like also experiencing the loss as well, and memories and all that. So it's quite like you're very open, honest, candid, like sometimes to a fault. I love also one of your poems where you say, I'm surprised I didn't hate my sister more, right? That's one of your poems that starts off with, which is wonderful again. And I think that is really necessary for like being completely honest with our feelings. And they don't always fit into a box. They don't always make
No.
sense. They actually rarely
Yeah.
do. But that's again also like processing emotions and so on by looking at all of those things. And that again, as you said at the beginning too, it's not one-sided, and there is a lot of suffering. There's also joy, and they all kind of mixed together in a sense.
There's joy. I mean, in odd ways, there's fun. And I felt that I had to be, if I was going to write about all of this, I had to be candid.
Mhm.
I had to say that there were times when even though I adored him, I absolutely hated him at certain moments. There were moments when I thought, if you don't die soon, I don't know how I'm going to go on. These are thoughts that my gamble is anybody who's had a prolonged caregiving experience has felt and thought, but we don't say that kind of thing. I mean, we're just supposed to be heroines and always upbeat and ready to tackle the next problem, when in fact, uh, it is uh, it's very, very eroding day by day having those experiences, and you find yourself giving yourself away constantly, and then unable to locate who you are because you're just in response mode. And I wanted to get at that, but also in an atmosphere of love. And
Mhm.
that's complicated stuff. That requires a lot of different color crayons.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Um,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and caregiving and nursing and being there and so on. That's all like part of your themes, and it comes across
yeah.
to your poems very in a very moving way. And I want to talk. I would like to read you. I would like you to read us some of your poems. And when I read "Touched," like from the get go, that's the first poem of the Widow's Crayon box, and I was touched, moved, and then some. Right. So I'd love you to that I have you here to please read that poem for us, and then just briefly we can talk about it too.
Good. Thank you. I uh this is the very first poem in the Widow's Crayon box, and it's called Touched. When I feel moved and then say, I am touched, it's another presence inside me I sense. The dip of an oar, a canoe being launched. I'm the oar, but I'm the water, and sense at once initiation and response. After you died, I felt you next to me, and over months, you entered gradually into that lake and disappeared. Not gone, but so internalized that you're not next to me. You're not the port or the support. You're done being you. And my loneliness is so extreme that I feel moved by almost anything. Even the forehead of a dog that leans against my knee in an elevator. Things as brief as all the ways you would lean against me, getting a glass of water at the sink. Everything touches me now that I'm not touched, but moved.
Yeah, it's amazing, and
That's touched.
it's yeah, and for me, it's there's the presence, there's the absence, but then there's more presence through the absence as well. So I love that image of the dog too. Like when little things somehow become much more meaningful. Like they seem, well, they might seem like little things, right? And because of that experience, it adds a new dimension to it. So I just love it. And again, the moving, touching and moving, and that kind of connection between them, it's very beautifully said.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate all of your insights into the poem. I should say, just for those of you out there who like to nerd out on poetry, that this is a poem that is kind of an overgrown sonnet. I started off to write a sonnet, but I had too much to say, so I went beyond the line limit. But it does have a rhyme scheme. And
Mhm.
part of what you're feeling in the poem is is the meeting of similar sounds in words that make a whole fabric inside the poem as well. And it's not necessarily that obvious when you hear the poem read, but they're there, being touched and moved.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's very beautiful. And so just to also switch gears a bit or a lot, I also quite enjoyed, and again, for a different reason, but it's also a magnificent poem, is Sex After 70. And
Okay.
again, talking about being candid, that's
Yeah.
a wonderful experience of that and demonstrates it. So, yeah, would you please read that one for us? And then we'll talk briefly about it as well.
Thank you, Arash. Very few people actually ask me to read this poem, so I'm happy to do it, and I'm happy to open up the conversation. It's fun to have this exchange with you. So, Sex After 70 is a short poem, and it takes place actually. You wouldn't necessarily know it from the poem, but it takes place during COVID. Uh, and I'll read it, and then we can
Yeah,
chat
yes, yes.
afterwards. Just to say to the audience that yes, there is sex after 70, and yes, there is sex when you're ill.
Yes.
Sex after 70. After we cleaned out our closets, we started on our sex lives. No new techniques, just forgiving debts. After we cleaned out one closet, we discovered another room back there and met as a long surprise of a spring afternoon arrived through the threshold of that closet on a spare bed we'd been saving all our lives. So it's not a particularly graphic poem. Um, I pulled the curtain over that, but it's the feeling of course, we didn't really describe us. We discover a spare room literally. I mean, suddenly in our condo, but reconnecting physically was like discovering that spare room. And suddenly things opened out, and we could, when you have various effects of immunotherapy drugs and that sort of thing, you find yourself in bed not for sensuous reasons. You're just flat out tired. But as we woke ourselves up and had a physical relationship that was entirely opposite of illness, then it added this other dimension to our marriage, and just gave us just a sensuous apprehension of the day. And I'm talking about afternoon sex, by the way. I'm not talking, which is one of the aspects I feel of sex after
It felt
70.
spontaneous, right? The whole experience felt spontaneous. I love the juxtaposition of cleaning closets and then like sex. It's like,
Yes,
okay, but we don't usually correlate the two
I
with each
know,
other,
I
but
know.
you're never safe, you know? And that's the outspurt of like being spontaneous and
Yes,
living life
but
at any age. And again, I like
yeah,
the focus here of talking about after 70 because some people believe it's over by then. It's like, no, it's not, you
no,
know, it's
I
never
know,
over
no, it's not
until it
over.
is, right? So
As
then,
long
yeah,
as long as you have hands, as long as you can touch,
yeah,
it's not over.
I love
Um,
that.
and um, people, perhaps in more sensuous cultures, understand that. I mean, I think that one understands that, say, in France or in Italy, maybe. Uh, in from my South American friends have a more sensuous approach to life, but there is also a sense, maybe a North American sense, that after 50 it's all over.
Yeah.
And I just want to say to everybody out there, oh no, it's not.
Wonderful. Yes, that's definitely. And I like also, it doesn't have to be a new technique. You know, you can just have the old
Yeah,
techniques and just
yes,
like
just the
enhance on
same old
them.
stuff is fine.
Wonderful. And for sensuality, I think another aspect that I've seen, apart from the colors and well, the sex and all that, is also food. And so enjoying food, and that's something I'm very passionate about as well. And so, yeah, would and you have would like to read your last poem, Honeycrisp?
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
let's hear that
absolutely.
one.
I'm very happy to read it. There, yes, there is food in the book. It's quite domestic because, well, because a lot of these things just occurred in our house, and the house, just becomes a kind of a harbor for us, and domestic life goes on. And this last poem in the book is called Honey Crisp, and I mean Honey Crisp apples.
Yes.
And I don't think you need to know anything here extra, except that the third line to the end, I use the French word for apple, pomme. And since this is largely an English speaking audience, I thought I would just sort of say that because it suddenly occurs at the end. And I'm taking a terrible risk here. I've written a poem in which I'm talking to an apple, and the apple is my audience. And for those of you who know a famous poem, Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright, you know that William Blake is talking to an animal. And that is a poem that's addressed to a wild animal, to a tiger. And I thought, I mean, obviously I know the poem very well, and I wondered, can I actually speak to this apple? And I decided that I would. And this poem, which ends the widow's crayon box, is, and those, I piled up some widow's crayon boxes back there underneath the painting. Now, those of you listening to the podcast won't be able to see them, but on YouTube you can see them. So this last poem uh, takes that dare that I made to myself, and was originally, before it was published in this book, was originally published in the Walrus. And I'm very happy to say that it was the poem that received the most email responses from people who were inspired by the poem to think about their own lives and to write to the magazine. So it's an honor to read this. Honey Crisp. Hello, Wizen Face. Hello, Apple. Understudy in the fridge since March. It's September. Hello, wrinkly red cheeks. I'll bet you're almost a year old. Born last autumn, kept in the fruit storage built half underground on the farm, then in the snow sold to me. Hello, my honey crisp. Well, my honey, no longer crisp. Are you asking why you haven't been eaten by now? Because that man hewed to his routines, an apple for lunch every day, the same red punctuation. You were earmarked for the date. He slipped from my arms, and we both slid to the floor. Red Angel, are you listening? 911, hospital, hospice, and 10 days later, you were about 6 months old then. He died and was carried to a cold shelf. Hello, smiley stem. Hello, days, moving you from spot to spot. Hello, week, where I forgot and left you at the back and went about my new life. Greetings, new groceries. Their jumble causes a rearrangement of your bin. So I have to pick you up. Would you rather have been eaten and lived on as energy? Not yet. Not yet, my pum. Hello, soft, wrinkled face in my palms. Honeycrisp.
Wonderful, yeah, and I love the also the well, the wordplay also with palm, right? But and palm and also like the transferring into energy and that kind of. So is and again, if you're comfortable with this, but is there like a spiritual dimension? Do you think that we are moving into another world? Do you think that is something, or do you think it's kind of ends with that, and we just live in people's hearts and minds and memories?
It, it's hard to say. It's hard to say, but uh I did feel his energy after he died. Um, and after people I've loved or been close to, I can feel their energy, and sometimes a sense of that person is so palpable after they pass away. I had an experience. I was just walking along on the street and I felt my late husband's hand at my back. I
Mhm.
just felt it there.
Yeah.
And now I know that these things are coming from me. They're my feelings. But at the same time, you do have a sense of being visited. It feels external. It doesn't feel like it's all coming from you. And but I don't have a codified uh, way of thinking about this. I do have a sense though of ideas returning. Uh, you know, my late husband was, I mean, he was an intellectual. He lived in his head, even though he was a marathon runner, and even though he had his own sensuous life, he was a guy who lived in his head. And I keep thinking that somehow I have a poem about this. It's in one of the poems in the book where somehow um, and I ask the reader if you've ever had thoughts that you've never thought before. And then I say, they could be his. They could be, I feel thoughts circulate around and come back to us. And the sense of that is they're ancient thoughts, you know, biblical thoughts, um, thoughts from, oh, the great Babylonian princess poet Enheduanna, these really ancient figures, and those thoughts come back to us. I mean, ideas uh, flourish and then they fade away and then return, and all of that seems to me to be great human connections, and in a weird way, kind of beyond life and death.
Mhm.
And that's might sound a little marshmallow minded. I've gone quite far afield here. It's all your fault, Arash.
Yes,
You
I
asked
know.
me this question. um, so I gave you my long-winded answer.
Yeah, and I think we want to make things we want things to make sense for us. So we're trying again that box, right? And that's why my one of my words that one of my favorite words is transcendence, because I think
Oh, yes,
transcending that. And once we're
yes.
transcending, we don't know where we are, but we know it's not where we think we are, right? So it goes beyond that. And I think that's good enough because again, that's good to have that sense because some people don't, right? And that's fine too. But I think there's something else too. And there's a lot of things that don't make sense. And we just have to go with it often. We don't always get all the answers we want or need. And that's the joy of it too.
Yes, it's I think I personally feel that it's good to live
Mhm.
knowing that you don't know everything, that that we live among mysteries.
And
And
it's okay. I think that's also
yes, it's
because we
very
feel
okay.
bad about it. It's okay. Some things that just enjoy, just
Yes.
have some
Well,
fun.
it makes life richer.
Yes, it does.
Life is textured then. Or to use the crayon box metaphor, there are multiple colors. Uh, and you sense all of that and feel all of that. And that's what makes a rich life.
Yes. And you've had a very rich life yourself because so this we looked at your poet. You're an acclaimed poet. You were the former president of the Poetry Society of America. You have your one woman show, and I'd like to talk about that as well as the project that you have. That sounded very interesting. The Mullet Peacock Secret Poetry Room project.
Yeah.
So can we talk about those things too, and
Sure.
expanding just
Yeah.
the poetry and as well also your biographies, the lives of other people that you're interested in. So yeah, what would you say about those things?
Oh my goodness. Well, this is this is a lot to cover.
I know.
Uh, the secret poetry room is uh, a tiny room for one person to write one poem in. And I, my husband and I did not have children. So uh, we thought about what we wanted to do for our legacies. And my husband has two archives, one at Western University and one in the States at the University of Buffalo, where they are making a James Joyce museum. I am I'm both Canadian and American. I had one Canadian grandmother, one American grandmother, and I grew up in Buffalo, just over the border. I'm very, very dual. Uh, and I ended up, even though I was an exchange student in Toronto, I ended up going to university in the States. And I thought about what could I leave? What could I do that would help young first generation college students who are going to a state university as I did? What could I give them a place, some space, literal space, so they could have space in their heads to just write a poem? And that's what the secret poetry room is. The library at Binghamton University gave a study room, and then I raised the money to create this kind of magical room with a special door and a beautiful chair and rug and a desk and lovely lighting. And it's you it has no sign. You have to discover it. It's in the stacks of the library. But of course, everyone's discovered it by now. It's in
Mhm.
constant use, and it's a cherished place.
Mhm.
And I'm hoping that it's a model for many libraries who even have, you know, any space that's just slightly bigger than a broom closet. You don't need a lot of space. just for one person to write one poem. And I'm very moved when I go back and visit. I brought some people back to visit. I knocked on the door, and there was a science student in the room, an astrophysics student who came into the room to write a poem. And I thought, oh, was this young man was sent from central casting just to make me happy that I volunteered my energy to create this kind of thing. I feel that people write poems in extreme emotions. My hope is he was writing a love poem. And to give people a place for that, wow. So that's the Secret Poetry Room, and maybe there are listeners who are inspired by this idea to make a secret poetry room at a library they frequent, or they're an alum looking for a project to do, a legacy project. There it is.
And I love the juxtaposition again, the lack of space. It reminds me of Shakespeare, of Hamlet, like king in a nutshell, you know? It's like,
Yeah.
you have that and you have infinity within you in this small space.
Yes, yes. A long time ago, I wrote for House and Garden magazine, and it was well understood at the magazine that cozy small places were creative places. Uh, it is. It's not the same to write a poem in a stadium, for instance. I mean, it's nice to have a small, cozy place for your imagination.
And so you're interested in lives of others too. And you do mention Virginia Woolf in your poems too. You
Yeah.
quote from her and so on. So I found that very interesting. And also, like, why the lives of other people? What is it that draws you to do biographies, for instance?
Well, I wrote poetry since I was a child, and when I married Mike, uh, I I had time in a way that I hadn't had some time before, and uh, he said, "Well, why don't you write some prose?" He said, "You used to write things, stories and other kinds of things like that." And I didn't lead that kind of a life. I wrote poetry and I taught and I was busy. And so I began to write a memoir. And uh, as I saw the shape of my own life in time and how events and places influenced me, and I finished that, and my one woman show and poems came out of that.
Oh,
And I was very, very pleased to be able to do that off Broadway, off Broadway actually, and with a Canadian director though, Louise Fagan, and just to keep thinking about how people's lives have shapes. And when my husband and I went to uh, the UK because he was speaking there, I rediscovered the work of Mary Delaney, and she's an amazing 18th century collage artist uh, who invented the art of botanical collage when she was 72 years old.
oh wow.
And yes, and completed 985 of these, and they are miraculous. They're amazing. And they're all at the British Museum in London. And I discovered, I knew about her work because I had seen it many, many years before in New York City. But I rediscovered it there in London and bought a wonderful catalog of her works by a descendant of hers, Ruth Hayden. And I discovered in reading it that our lives had certain connections,
Oh, wow.
that I was a 21st century woman responding to an 18th century woman. I mean, she was very well born and, had uh, connections to the royal family. I don't. I'm a completely working class person. But she married at 45. This was her second husband and had a great creative flowering. I married my second husband at 45. I had a great creative
Mm, yes.
flowering. I was looking for a role model. uh, you know, we look for role models our whole lives, Arash. In some ways, your podcast, your YouTube is about role models. I mean, you have all these people, you gather all of these people together, and they inspire listeners. Oh, look what that person did. And I was inspired by Mrs. Delaney, and the more I got into her life, I wrote a small essay about Mrs. Delaney and my mother, two role models of mine. And then I became aware of a biography fellowship in New York City at the Leon Levy Center for Biography. And my husband helped me write a proposal because I'm not a scholar. Um, so I was terrified. uh, but I got so interested in her life. I thought, okay, I'm going to write a biography, and and my biography isn't going to be one of those straight biographies where I begin when she's born and end when she dies.
I didn't
Uh,
expect that, honestly,
I,
actually.
I wanted to track every instance of creativity in her life that I could find. And she kept these journals. There are journals and letters. So there's lots of
Oh,
documentation. And because I wanted to find out how she was so actively creative so late in her life. And it was a joy to track all of that, even though it was terrifying and it took me 8 years to do it. But she became a guiding spirit and role model for me. And I did another biography after that called Flower Diary about a Canadian painter because I wanted to do something really Canadian. And it's about Mary Heaster Reid, a fabulous 19th and early 20th century Canadian flower artist. And just remember her name, Mary Heaster Reid. Her work is in many Canadian museums.
wonderful. Yeah. So, and thank you so much, Molly, for being on Rash's World. Again, your book is the Widow's Crayon Box. You're an acclaimed poet, also a scholar. You might not accept it, but yes, you are a scholar, and many, many things more. And thank you so much for being here, for being open, candid, like your poetry, like your work. Such a joy talking to you. Such a colorful conversation here, and thank you for sharing your joy and light and wisdom here. And it's been such a pleasure.
Rosh, thank you so much. Thanks for thinking of me, for remembering to reach out, and for all of your interesting questions. I really appreciate it. Thank you.